Professor Anima Adjepong. Thank you very much for finding the time to do this interview and to share with us about your new publication. And I just want to thank you and to congratulate you on your successes. And I wish you many more. What is your book about?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me here. I'm happy to be part of this conversation and to share my work with you. By way of introduction, and you made a point, as you said, I use they, them pronouns, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Cincinnati. I was born in Ghana, and I moved to the US when I was 15 years old. So I went to high school here. I think that's important to frame as part of what the book is about. The book, Afropolitan Projects Redefining Blackness, Sexualities, and Culture from Houston to Accra, it was my attempt to understand how being an African had changed since I moved to the US. And actually, specifically, what I mean is how being an African in the US had changed, the meanings of that. When I moved, I was very surprised to encounter so much ignorance about Africa and Africans. I went to high school and was asked by both adults and my classmates whether I lived in a tree or had a pet lion. By the time I got to college, it was a relief to be around other Africans. And when I was in graduate school, I became really interested because all of a sudden I was seeing African fashions on the internet. I was hearing African music. When we were in college, we didn't have access to those things. We used to try to figure out who was going home so that they could bring CDs and that sort of thing. And all of a sudden, it seemed like we were having access to African popular culture. And so it raised this question for me: what had changed, and how were Africans kind of understanding that change? One of the things, I'm a sociologist by training, and one of the things that sociologists typically do when they ask these questions is it could be about a broader perception, but which is to say external to the people who were creating that culture. But for me in this book, I was really interested in how Africans themselves were understanding this shift. What was the ways that they were plugging themselves into this global culture and resisting these narratives about Africa as this place of disaster. For the project, what became very clear for me was that this was not undifferentiated by class. The popular culture that was emerging, the way that an African identity was kind of entrenching itself within the US to begin with, was a very class privileged African identity. Around the time that I started this project, Blitz, the ambassador, who is coming out with a movie in December 2023, The Color Purple, had released an album called Afropolitan Dreams. But it was kind of talking about his own journey as an immigrant, his position as both a Ghanaian and an American, and the various kind of barriers that he came against, but also the possibilities that came up with that. And listening to that album got me thinking a bit differently about the research that I had been conducting. It kind of raised this question of, what is this thing about the Afropolitan doing for these class privileged Africans, and how are they shaping their identities to win? So in brief, the book examines this cultural politics through music as one element of it, but in particular in community space, how communities both in the US, specifically in Houston and in Accra, Ghana, are understanding themselves as Ghanaians to begin with, and then broadly as Africans of the world. Because of the nature of the project, it meant that I did research in both of these places to understand these questions. And what I found was that Ghanaians in Houston were really articulating themselves as Ghanaians and also as Americans. And that was a very clear thing for them. That shaped how they put together their community. It shaped the kind of Christian identity that they espoused. And it also shaped the ways that they related to Ghanaians back home. Likewise, Ghanaians in Ghana were affirming themselves as Ghanaians, as Africans, and as citizens of the world, specifically Africans of the world. And their cultural politics really showed that. So the book kind of examines those similarities and differences along the lines of race, class, sexuality, and place.
Why Houston?
That's a great question. Houston, there are kind of two answers to that question. First, there's the answer that I was doing my PhD in Austin, Texas, and I was interested, and so there was a kind of facility of getting to Houston. Now, there's a Ghanaian community in Austin, but it wasn't, the convenience wasn't the only factor. Houston, at the time, I don't know how the demographics have shifted now, but at the time, Houston was the fourth largest city in the U.S. It was what they call a majority-minority city, which means that the majority of people in Houston are not white. They're not all one race or ethnicity, but they're just majority are not white. Houston is also called Little Lagos, which is a kind of indicator of the number of Nigerians there. As a lot of my interlocutors in Houston told me, Nigerians run this town. And so I was really interested in how this city, in which Ghanaians were not the majority, but in which I call an African city in the book, how Ghanaians in Houston were really understanding themselves. And the other part of it was that I was interested in how we think about immigrant identities, African immigrant identities, specifically in the Southern U.S. So many studies about African immigrants take place on the East Coast, largely in New York. A few have taken place in Cincinnati, where I am, and Chicago might be another area. But I was interested in how that Southern U.S. Space was also shaping the kind of politics and identity of Ghanaian immigrants.
Why are these things important to you?
Yeah. So a lot of the book has a lot of different themes, and one of the themes that I really kind of think about in the last chapter of the book on Blackness is important to me because of this kind of ongoing claim. And maybe that's kind of reduced a little bit, but there used to be this kind of Africans don't know they're Black until they come to the US or something like that. So it was a question about how Africans are racialized and how we understand our racial identities. One of the things with Afropolitan projects for me was that I was in conversation with Vilna Bashi-Treitler's book, The Ethnic Project. In her book, Treitler is talking about how when immigrants come to the U.S., they're slating themselves into this landscape where race is a master category. That's what sociologists call it, which means that race becomes a very critical defining feature of yourself. And within this landscape, where white is at the top of the hierarchy and Black is at the bottom, immigrants are trying to fit themselves in a space where they don't exist at the bottom. And it raised a question for me about where Africans fit in, because Africans are often at the bottom of a global racialized hierarchy in which Africa is just this, to go back to this kind of heart of darkness situation. And so where do Africans kind of fit into that? And I came to understand Afropolitan projects, as I describe it, as a kind of racial project. It's a racial project that has deep class components to it, because not everyone can be an Afropolitan. And so that was a really kind of important thing for me to understand how Ghanaians in Houston were thinking about their racialized identities, what kind of solidarity and what kind of distinctions they made amongst themselves and other Black people. And one of the things I found was that class was a very big part of that. In a similar way, how Ghanaians in Houston were thinking, how Ghanaians in Accra by thinking about their racialized position. And one of the things I think the book is able to offer is to think about how race and class are inextricably linked, so that there's not just one way of thinking about Blackness. The other element that was really kind of important and interesting for me was to think about the question of sexuality. In Houston, I was really kind of conscious of what a heterosexual space the Ghanaian community was. And it was one that was really heightened in 2015 when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. So there were a lot of conversations about what it meant for America and the downfall of civilization and all this sort of stuff. This was happening within the community, which also kind of juxtaposed against some of the ways that I was accepted in the community as a queer person. And so it raised this question for me of what are the ways in which a kind of heterosexual politic is shaping the meanings of community here, and how is a kind of claim to tradition and belonging both in the US and in Ghana animating that? On the other hand, one of the things I was really seeing, especially in online activist spaces in Ghana, was a claim to openness, right? A kind of acceptance of expansive genders and sexualities, primarily sexualities. And so I was interested in how questions of sexuality were being engaged across the borders. Often there's this kind of idea that back home is very conservative, very anti-queer, et cetera, et cetera. But in my work, I found it to be a bit different from that. In Ghana, there were people who were vocally speaking up in support of LGBTQ people. There were people who were resisting this idea that it's not our culture, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in the US, especially within this kind of Christian space, there was this reproduction of African sexualities as heterosexual and US American sexualities as heterosexual, which was also framed by Christianity. There's a lot more and I could go on, but I'll take a little pause here and you can ask additional questions if you want me to extend on that.
Can you take me through the research process? What are the challenges you faced? How was it? And how has the book been received? What were the politics of publishing?
Hey, so the research process, let's start there. The book started out as an ethnography. And so I spent about 1.5 years in Houston, Texas, attending events in the Ghanaian community. And then after about a year, I did interviews with folks in Houston. The reason that I spent a year was I thought it was really important to not only understand how the community operated, but also to gain some trust. As a stranger entering into the space, I wasn't interested in just doing a bunch of interviews and leaving. I really wanted to understand the internal logics of the space and to develop trust so that I could also ask meaningful follow-up questions. Towards the end of my time in Houston, I realized that the project was actually incomplete if I only stayed in the US. There was such an intimate relationship between Houstonians and Ghanaians. And so I was interested in doing a kind of comparison between cities. And that's why I went to Accra. The research also involved a lot of cultural analysis. So I was looking at music, I was looking at art, I was looking at the aesthetic of the Afropolitan as part of my analytical scope. The primary challenge for me was in Houston. As I mentioned, I'm a queer person, and one of the things that I was really worried about while doing the work was a broad rejection from the community, so that I wouldn't be able to complete it. This never came to pass. I was, as the book is evidence of, I was able to finish it, but it really kind of raised this question for me of how does a queer person do ethnographic research, especially in space, especially when they're not necessarily doing queer research. How to kind of navigate access in queer antagonistic spaces and what to do about that. I don't necessarily have answers to those questions. I've done a little bit of reflection in different spaces on it, but it is a question that comes up for me when doing research. In terms of the publication process, the advice I got when I started writing the book was just to write it. And so I didn't really kind of spend time pitching the book until it was done. And I find that I was very lucky I had met a friend had introduced me to my editor at UNC Press at a conference. And just around when the book was done, he emailed me, Lucas Church, he emailed me, says, hey, about a year ago we met and you're working on this book, how's it going? And so in that regard, it was pretty easy in terms of finding a publisher for the book. And I was very lucky with great reviewers who were very supportive of the project. However, one of the things I've been thinking about right now is where the book is being presented. I was recently at a conference, the National Women's Studies Association conference. I'm a gender studies professor, and the press was there, but my book wasn't. And then I was at the African Studies Association, and the press doesn't go to the African Studies Association. And what I realized is that I'm in this kind of awkward place where my book is, I'm a sociologist by training. Sociologists in the US don't really engage with Africa. And so if sociologists are teaching my book, I'm always quite curious what it is that they're using. I'm not an anthropologist, and I was surprised and honestly disappointed that my book wasn't at the National Women's Studies Association conference, because it's a book about gender and sexuality and queerness. And so I think if anything, it should be there. So it kind of brings to my mind this recognition that doing work within this African space in a US market perhaps there are these assumptions about who the audience for the book is, which could be a limitation on how far the book can travel.
You are trying to understand, where do Africans find themselves in this racialized American South? But in addition to that, I think you're also raising another question about where is the place of African intellectual work that is produced in the diaspora?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And it's a challenging and kind of scary question for an African intellectual in the diaspora. And I mean, I think people smarter than me, I hope, have been kind of reflecting on these questions, because on the one hand, the work has to be framed for a US audience. And that's something that I really resisted in my book. I didn't want to be the person guiding you into the intimate lives of Africans. Of course, I write with a reader in mind who I want to understand what's happening in the text, but at the same time, I'm kind of resistant to producing a work that becomes this kind of spectacular, look at these spectacular Africans. So I think this is a question that I would be very interested to kind of continue to think more about, because it is an important one if we're located here and doing this work, how to continue to do the work in a way that is legible to other Africans on the continent, but also legible to our colleagues here.
What surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most? I think for me, it's been on the other end post-publication. I've been very pleasantly surprised by the reception of the work, which is to say, when I've met people who say, I've taught your work, it's very accessible, I taught it to first-year students, I'm thankful to hear that, because I'm really kind of working through big ideas. And most people teaching to first-year students are teaching to first-year US students. And so the fact that they're able to understand and identify with it is very, it means a lot to me. I recently taught it in one of my classes, and I was so happy to hear from immigrant students from South Asia talking about their connection to this. And I'm like, yeah, I think that is part of what this work allows for us to kind of see beyond these narrow binaries and to be able to think expansively and build connections. So that's something that makes it's a pleasant surprise. I didn't really expect that.
Is there anything else about this spectacular publication that you would like to share with us that I have not asked you?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I would say there are two things. One of the kind of motivations for the work does come from music. I mentioned Blitz's album. And so after the book came out, I put together some of the soundscapes of the book. So I have a Spotify playlist that I'll be happy to send you in case you want to add to it. I think really kind of thinking about the music of Afropolitan projects is something that excites me. And it's something that I think can draw folks into the work. Because in the different chapters, I talk about the music that was happening in any space. The other thing is that the book does include art, and there are a few photos or prints of painting in a photo and some and lyrics from a song. So I'm thankful to the artists who gave me permission to use that, and I do hope that folks will linger. If they pick up the book, linger on those art pieces as well, as I think they offer us another entry point into thinking about how class privileged Africans are shaping their position in the world.
Very well done. Very, very well done, Prof. And thank you so much.
Thank you.